Okay, so right guys, hello, welcome. It's lovely to see you. I'm talking here to Melanie Anderson and Lisa Kröger, who are the editors of the fantastic collection. I'm going to hold it up actually. Shirley Jackson, Influences and Confluences. It's probably come up back to front here because we're on Zoom, but hopefully everyone can see it. So part of the remit for the symposium is to critically reflect upon the past and the current state of scholarship in and around Shirley Jackson, her life and her work. And as such, we're really delighted. And one of the things we want to do is just remind people of the excellent work that has taken place both in the past and also more recently, like this collection. And so we're really delighted to have Melanie and Lisa here today to talk about the collection and maybe a little bit about the genesis of the collection. And you know, one thing that kind of struck me as I was sort of thinking about how to approach this is, oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Bernice Murphy. Hello. Of course, we're on Zoom. We've got to. One thing that struck me is that this is only the second edited collection on Jackson. The previous one edited by someone known to me, i.e. myself, but was quite a long time before, back in 2005. And I think it's really quite shocking in a way that yours was still only the second edited collection on Jackson. And in a way, I think it anticipated the Jackson Renaissance. It was one of those texts like Ruth Franklin's wonderful biography of Jackson, which I'm sure you're both very familiar with, that kind of was sort of anticipating this current, or sort of on the crest of this wave of interest in Jackson. So, I mean, first of all, I mean, before we get kind of stuck into the genesis of the book itself, I wondered if you wouldn't mind just telling us how both of you maybe came to be interested in Jackson's work. And I know you've collaborated prior to this collection as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit about maybe what Jackson has meant to you both professionally and personally, and then we can get into the collection itself, if that's okay. So I don't know who wants to get started, or maybe like I pick somebody at random, or maybe
I will probably let Melanie take this answer, just because she was the one who actually really got me reading Shirley Jackson. We were in graduate school together. We shared an office, and we were just talking about things that we enjoyed reading. And I always say she was proselytizing for Shirley Jackson. Like, she was just out there trying to convert me, which she did successfully. So I'll let Melanie, I guess, pick that one up.
So Melanie, is it true that you are a Jackson evangelist of long standing?
Yeah, apparently. I mean, that was probably like 2004. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess my first experience with Shirley Jackson's work would have been when I read The Lottery in school. And I feel like that happened when I was in middle school. I remember the story. I don't remember precisely how old I was. I remember being shocked by it. I remember kind of liking it because I was just so shocked that she could like start out with such a normal day, and then everything turned so dark so quickly. And then I really didn't think about her again for a while. And I guess I was in college, and The Haunting of Hill House movie was coming out with Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones. And I had seen mentioned that it was based on a book. And so as an English major, I was interested in that. And I was like, wait, this is the person that wrote The Lottery? And so I went to the store and bought the book and read it. And I loved it. Like, I was a fan of ghost stories and haunted house stories to a certain extent. I did not at the time think of myself as a horror aficionado, or maybe even a Gothic fan. I didn't start thinking of myself as that until I met Lisa. She proselytized me for that, I guess. But yeah, I just thought it was great. I mean, I thought it was a great story. I wasn't super impressed with the movie when I saw it, because I just felt like it was so different. It wasn't really as close to the book as I was expecting. And so I went to graduate school basically fresh off of this, like loving this particular book, which is still my favorite Jackson, I think, is The Haunting of Hill House. And I think when I was talking to Lisa, I probably was reading the short stories. I feel like that was around the time where maybe I was reading some of the short stories in the Lottery collection. I think I probably read We Have Always Lived in the Castle like around that time. And so, yeah, Lisa and I were talking about some of the things we enjoyed reading. And I was just like, I'm really enjoying Shirley Jackson. And, you know, I'm in graduate school and I wasn't seeing a whole lot written about her. And so Lisa and I and another graduate colleague of ours actually wrote papers on The Haunting of Hill House, and, you know, presented at a small conference that wasn't too far away from where we were at grad school. And it just kind of went on from there, I guess.
But that's great, and I love that your origin story is meeting in graduate school as well, because I think quite often such really wonderful collaborations can come out of that, you know, when it sort of works, and when ideas wise you kind of gel with somebody, and you know, you both realize, hang on, this thing or this person is really cool, and why isn't there more out there like this on this topic or individual or text. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, you know, your specific impetus for sort of the project, and why you felt that it was the right time for a collection like this. Because I mean, Melanie, as you point out, you know, there had been at that time really quite a really surprising lack of work on. I mean, there had been some really excellent work done on Jackson. You know, a whole generation of feminist scholars, in particular in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, had done really great work, but still this relative gap, I suppose. That I think your volume is really, like, in terms of its scope, it really broadens the conversation about Jackson in some incredibly useful ways. So what about the specifics of the germ of the idea for the particular collection? How did that come about? Did it all arise from those grad school conversations, or did you kind of revisit things?
You know, I think that was something that we kind of revisited year after year, you know, as we were just talking about things that we were reading. Once she got me reading Shirley Jackson, I didn't stop, obviously. And, you know, I think I read Hill House first and then moved on to We Have Always Lived in a Castle, which I was just absolutely enamored with. And then I read The Sundial, which is still one of my favorites. And the more I was reading and the more we were kind of talking about it, we were talking a lot about how much in literature that has come after Shirley Jackson, where we see her influences. And I was reading, you know, as a horror fan, I grew up reading a lot of Stephen King. You can see a lot of her influences in Stephen King. He's written about it. I can't remember which of his nonfiction. I think it was Dance Macabre, where he wrote about the influences of Shirley Jackson on his work. But, you know, we were just kind of, I think, as scholars, interested in why more people weren't drawing those comparisons, and weren't looking at contemporary, especially contemporary horror writers and contemporary writers of like the ghostly or the macabre, maybe, why they weren't drawing those connections between them and Shirley Jackson. And I think that's really where the idea for us wanting to get more scholarship out there started. And then I know when we really started putting together the idea for the book, we specifically wanted to look at texts that weren't Hill House. I mean, we still have essays on Hill House, but that was one thing that we were, we were just really trying to get as much as we could.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on to that a little bit if I can. You know, I think two things that kind of helped us think that we could do a collection on Shirley Jackson was that we had already worked together on an essay collection, Spectral Identities, which was very broad, and it was basically about how ghosts were being used in various media. So it included fiction and film. And so we had gotten that project through. We knew we could work well together. We had written the introduction together, and we were looking for another project, just like Lisa said. I also, at the time, you know, was having conversations with Joan Wiley Hall, who was at University of Mississippi, and talking about Jackson and what was out there and couldn't more be out there, basically. And she would give me heads up when stuff was coming out. And so we knew that the Penguin editions were coming out. That would have been like just after 2010. I think 2010 might have been when the first Library of America came out. Yeah. And I heard an interview with Hall actually on like NPR about it. And I was like,
Carlot's one, wasn't it?
Yeah. And then we had heard, I think it was like while we were working on the essay collection, we found out that Ruth Franklin's biography was coming. So, I mean, we were just like, this is this is it, you know? And it just seemed, it was just too, I don't know, it was like 2014. And we're like, okay, we have almost all of Jackson's stuff back in print. It was right before Let Me Tell You came out. And I was just, you know, talking to Lisa, and I'm like, I think that this is a time to do it. Originally, we had thought about just doing straight up influences. Like, we even thought about contacting writers and seeing if they wanted to talk about Shirley Jackson's influence. But the more we thought about it, we're just like, there's not that much, there's cool scholarly stuff out there, but now people have access to these novels. So maybe we could push it a little bit. And so actually a couple of days ago, Lisa and I were actually looking at our call for papers from 2014 for the collection. And yeah, we specifically say we want papers on almost anything, like but the lottery and the Haunting of Hill House, but we still got, obviously we still got that, you know, so we were trying to push further along, but I think it was just like people, unless you're buying used books, people had only had access to the newer stuff coming out for like 4 years. And so, but we had, I mean, we had some great papers that were pushing boundaries, like looking at Jackson in film, like your paper, for example. We had another paper looking at like films, more like comparing the Haunting of Hill House film adaptations. But yeah, looking back at the CFP, it was pretty ambitious, I think, for the time period, because we're just like, here's all these people that you could compare Shirley Jackson to. And what we got, I think, was great, but I think it also shows that people were still coming to grips, you know, with publishing on Jackson and all the stuff that we could do with her. And I've just been so happy to see everything that's come since.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I think you've both raised there the issue of actually accessing her work, which is so important. I mean, when I did my PhD on Jackson here in Ireland in the early 2000s, you literally, the only Jackson books you could really buy were Hill House, and maybe a collection of The Lottery. I had to order everything from sort of special collections. So I didn't even own copies of a lot of the stuff I did my PhD on, which sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud now, because you certainly couldn't get it on this side of the Atlantic. And stuff like Hangs a Man and The Bird's Nest, or even the Sundial, were incredibly hard to get a hold of. I mean, it is that, I mean, the sheer availability is, I think, is such an important part of the story there. I'm glad you highlighted it. I mean, it's, yeah, it seems nuts to think about it now, but you literally couldn't buy a lot of Shirley Jackson unless you were looking for like novel tie-in versions of the 1999 film.
Exactly. The first time I read The Sundial was because Jill Anderson sent me a used copy of it. It's like, oh, thank you. Now I can read this book, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think I you know, it's funny that you say that, because I read a lot of the novels that weren't Hill House or Castle, where I got them on my Kindle, because I think people had just started putting them out that way. I couldn't even get hard copies at that time, which is wild to think about.
No, it isn't. Like, even in terms of like so much of academic dissemination as well as through teaching, and in a practical sense, up until quite recently, you know, or until about 7 or 8 years ago, I couldn't have assigned something like The Sundial here because students wouldn't have been able to get a copy of the book, perhaps, or, you know, like practical considerations like that. But I mean, one thing you note in your intro is, and we've kind of touched upon this already, is that Jackson's work was, to put it mildly, rather critically neglected until the last maybe 10, 15 years or so in some respects. I suppose what I'd ask you guys is what you see the collection as sort of significantly adding to this previous body of Jackson criticism. And I think you've maybe partially answered that already, in terms of you do have a very specific and unique focus, which is Jackson in terms of her influence, which I think is such a brilliant idea. But I wondered, was that something that you kind of arrived at straight away, or was that something that kind of emerged as you, because obviously coming up with a theme for a collection, I mean, it can be like, how long is a piece of string in terms of how specific or how focused you want, or how non-specific you want to be. And then, of course, as you sort of indicated, what people will send into you won't necessarily always, you know, fit in. But you might say, well, actually, it's still doing something there I want to include.
Yeah, I mean, Lisa, correct me if I get getting this wrong, because it's been like 7 years. But yeah, we initially were just like, okay, well, we're going to focus on influence. And, you know, just like Lisa said earlier, we were kind of thinking like, okay, well, people are like Jill Anderson's piece where she talks about possible Jackson influence on Bechdel. That's kind of what we're thinking, or like Jackson in her milieu, or maybe things that had influenced Jackson, because I was reading a lot of older supernatural fic at the time, and I'm like, I know Jackson was probably aware of this. But yeah, I mean, the papers that you get kind of help you know where you're going, if that makes sense. So if I'm remembering right, we just basically looked at all the papers that we had. And yeah, I mean, there are certain ones you want to include. And I think that was where we got like I think the organization of the book came very organically from what we had. So that's where we ended up with like the three. I don't think it's actually, I think in the intro we talked about like it was 3 sections, but it's not actually, it's like, so we had the first few essays were pieces that were about influences on Jackson. That could be writers, or it could be themes. I think we had somebody talk about her place in campus novels.
James Dobson, I think it's a particularly wonderful article.
That was really fun. Yeah, connecting her to Donna Tartt and stuff like that. And then we had that middle ground where it was like, where is she in her time period? And then we ended up with, I think it was 3 kind of contemporary essays. So one was about like a graphic novel, and 2 on film. And that was just organically fell out that way. I feel like if we had gotten, I feel like if we'd gotten more essays on Jackson's influence on more contemporary writers, maybe we would have gone in that direction. But it was just like, this was where we kind of wanted to go. And then these were the essays we had, and how can we make them kind of go in an order that takes you from, you know, kind of back into what could have influenced her to what maybe she's influencing now. I feel like that was our intention. Am I right, Lisa?
No, we did have those conversations, and you know, and it is funny kind of how it morphed as we were like what we had originally thought for this collection and what we ended up with. Because I think it does, as we're talking through this, you know, hindsight is 2020, and you can kind of see things that you couldn't see then. But I think it does really just highlight the fact that there wasn't that much scholarship at the time when we put this out, because we had been, I think, both very specific and kind of very broad in our call for papers in what we wanted. But we tried to show all the different types of scholarship that you could kind of work with Shirley Jackson. And I think we had to kind of cast that broad net of like, this was her influences, things she might have been reading. This is how she was working with current constructions of her day. And this is how she influenced people. But yeah, I think it was just because there just wasn't that much out there at the time. And so we ended up with I think a really wonderfully, I don't want to say broad, because I feel like that has negative connotations, but a really wide range of scholarship. And
it's got a really, like, I was looking through it there again today, because I find if I look over a text before I talk about it, it tends to go about it, but just a teaching tip I've learned over the years. But you know, because you've got a nice sense of sort of progression as well, because you got that, you know, that excellent essay on Jackson and 18th century literature, and it's Michael Wilson, sorry, and somebody else. I forgot the other author's name. Forgive me, other author. I'm sorry. So it's Samuel Richardson, and then you know, and the authors point out, you know, that this is something that people mention a lot about Jackson. Oh, she's influenced by 18th century literature, but they're so spot on. No one had ever actually really written about that in detail, and I think it makes a great opening, and it feeds into, you know, and then you've got a nice sense of symmetry with ending with the sort of film influences on Jackson. So it's all sort of brought more up to date as well. And I think your categories as well. I mean, you know, was it Jackson and her literary forebears, Jackson and the post-war literary scene, which again is something that hadn't been done a lot at that time, you know, and still I think there's a lot of stones to be left to be turned over in that area as well. And then her more recent legacy. So there is a really nice sense of structure there, which I think with a collection is something we all aim for, but we don't always necessarily achieve as well as you'd like. But I think you definitely have here. One thing I wanted to ask you about that is, was there a category that, I mean, by the sounds of it, there is a category maybe which is sort of Jackson and contemporary authors that you maybe would have liked to have included, but in the end it didn't just work. It just didn't work out. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, her contemporaries.
Oh, sorry, today's sort of horror. Sorry, I phrased that awkwardly.
Oh yeah, no, that was something we were actually, Mel and I were just talking about this week, talking about Shirley Jackson's scholarship. Like, we would still love to hear a bit more scholarship on what contemporary authors today, how they view Shirley Jackson and how her work has specifically influenced their work. I'd love to see more authors do exactly what Stephen King did and just kind of walk us through how that was. But I mean, also like her contemporaries, I would love to know. I know, Mel, we were talking about how we'd love to see more on Shirley Jackson and Ellison and kind of what that was, because that's a stone that's left unturned. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, because the letters are sort of tantalizing in a way, because she does refer to stuff that she's reading and authors she likes, but she tends not to go into it in a lot of detail. But what comes up loads is actually her interest in children's literature and in fantasy. And I think that's a whole area that, I mean, hopefully I'm sure people are going to follow up on that. But like, who knew Shirley Jackson, massive fan of The Wizard of Oz, for instance. So I'm working here in a stealth way, maybe to encourage you to think about,
oh man, I just did Shirley Jackson and domesticity, but do
you feel you're Shirley Jackson out at this stage?
Never.
No, I'm always referencing Shirley Jackson. I can't help it.
Well, I've just, maybe planted a seed there, just I'll leave it with you. But one thing I wanted to ask too is just a few more questions, if that's okay, one of the things is that I think the collection is sort of working toward, which is something which is and accomplishes, which I think the current state of Jackson criticism has kind of picked up the ball and is running with it, which is brilliant, is expanding our perceptions of Jackson and her work in directions that haven't quite been looked at yet, or sort of haven't maybe even been considered before. So I'd wonder, was there any one essay or essays in the volume which for you personally made you think, actually, that's a side of Jackson I hadn't really thought of before, or that's a topic that struck you as something that was maybe affected how you felt about Jackson's work?
I'm glancing over the essays right
now. I'm doing the same.
It's an editor's worst nightmare to be quizzed.
And I got to pick a favorite. It's like, which of your children do you like the best? Like, these people might be watching. I know.
I know.
They're all excellent essays.
Should we just choose yours, Bernice? Like, should we?
I was about to say.
No, don't pick mine. No.
I was raving to Melanie about how you compared her work to Excision and Stoker.
Oh, I love Excision so much.
Excision is one of my favorite movies, and I had never made that connection before. But her ideas of this female adolescence, and I mean, that's just such a rich time anyway to write about, and I think it's just full of horrors in and of itself, even when you're not in a movie like Excision. But I like that idea. I like the idea of looking specifically at female adolescence, especially because even in her books, even some of the older women, I would almost categorize as adolescent. Like they feel Eleanor. Somehow stuck there. Yeah, Eleanor is a perfect example. But even Hangs a Man, I feel like she feels a lot younger. So, and I don't, the Sundial, that's all levels of, but yeah, I like looking at it through that lens.
Yeah, I mean, I remember. No, sorry,
Helen, come on. Oh, I was just going to say, I think for me, I remember being really excited that we had an essay on the Road Through the Wall, because
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I would write about the Road Through the Wall, but I want to read what other people write about the Road Through the Wall. And that was like, because we were looking for things that weren't necessarily Haunting of Hill House or Lottery, we were like, yes, this is awesome. And I thought it was interesting to get Rich Pascal's take on that. And then also, I mentioned Jill Anderson's piece earlier, but I really like that connection between The Haunting of Hill House and Fun Home. I had not thought about that at all until we got her idea for that essay. And yeah, I feel like there's so many influences of Jackson around us that we don't even really see. And that was one of the ones I thought was really cool.
I think that's one of the things that the book sort of lays the foundations for, which I think has become increasingly obvious. I don't want to say that Jackson invented everything, but I think in a way that she anticipated in such an interesting way so much so much pop, not just in a literary sense, but in a pop culture sense, that it's only kind of becoming obvious now, which is, but one of the things I really liked about the collection was that there's quite a few of the essays that reference text, which at that time still had very little written about them. So there's quite a few pieces here which talk about Hangsaman, for instance, which such an incredible novel, but also until quite recently a very underappreciated novel. And you rightly mentioned The Road Through the Wall, which even a lot of Jackson enthusiasts haven't actually bothered to read yet, because they're, I think for some reason it seems to maybe put some people off. I don't know why, but yeah, it was lovely to see that that level of sort of genuine inclusiveness of particularly the novels in a way that isn't always the case, But I was going to ask you, this is one of my final questions, but we've kind of touched upon this before maybe, but if you were strong-armed into doing a sequel, which took on board, I was thinking of all that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years in Jackson's world, the explosion of interest in her life and work, the various film adaptations. I gather there are numerous dramatic adaptations in the works as well. Like everything's been kind of is sort of, I think, potentially going to be on screen at some stage. Would there be any one particular text or topic which you'd be absolutely determined to include if you were doing a, Shirley Jackson now, ! type collection?
One thing that I don't think we could have anticipated is how, I think Mel and I knew that there was going to be some sort of Shirley Jackson revival, because we knew the biography was coming out, and the new Let Me Tell You collection was coming out. So we knew that more of her novels were being published in paperback form. So just the accessibility, we were like, okay, more people, or at least scholars, are going to be reading Shirley Jackson. I don't think we ever anticipated, at least I didn't, that Shirley Jackson was going to become like a character in and of herself in popular culture. Because there was already the novel by Susan Scarf Merrill, which I think came out before our book, before
2014.
Yeah. So we knew about it, but the movie version hadn't come out. Obviously, Mike Flanagan's TV show hadn't come out, where Shirley's a character. I mean, the name, I guess. But I don't know. I would really love to see a Shirley Jackson scholar talk about that. Like, what happens when the author becomes like a character in pop culture, and what that does to readers' perceptions. And because there were things that I loved about, like, both the Flanagan TV show and the novel and the movie. Elizabeth Moss was wonderful. But then there's also some things that I was just like, ooh, I don't know if I like that. Yeah. I don't like the way they portrayed her there. So
she's portrayed as quite an abject figure, isn't she?
Well, and even in the Flanagan TV show, Hill House The Haunting of Hill House is a novel, but it's written by one of the other characters. So it's not even written by
a man.
A man. Yeah. The authorship is completely like stolen from her, which I bristled at the whole time. But I would love to see people explore that, because I think that's a fascinating phenomenon.
Have you ever seen Oz Perkins' I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House? Because there's a character in that who I think myself, she's got the cat's eye glasses, and she's got a very Shirley Jackson style career, and it's a haunted house.
Yes. I would love to find out if that was intentional.
Well, apparently he was meant to do a film adaptation of We've Always Lived in the Castle, and he did that instead. So he said that in Rue Morgue. So I do think there's Sorry, right. I'm projecting with my Oz Perkins theory here. I apologize. Melanie, sorry, what about yourself? Did you have anything to add there?
I pretty much agree with Lisa. I think it's fascinating that we now have like Shirley Jackson as a character in Shirley Jackson. It's like very meta. And I think it's kind of cool that I don't know, I've noticed just especially in stuff that's related to Gothic and horror, that people are just way more aware of her. than I think they were, like, say 10 years ago. And, you know, it's gotten to the point where people actually get mad when you talk about Shirley Jackson, like during like Women in Horror Month or whatever, because people are like, oh, we know about her now. And I'm like, well, you know, we didn't at one point. And I like, you know, I think it's cool we're still celebrating her. I feel like she's I don't know if she's like, you know, Poe with sunglasses on the pin or the socks yet, but I feel like she's getting to that, like, there's a culture character of her that's maybe separating out from the real person that I think is going to be on a metatextual level, might be interesting to investigate. And I know in Shirley Jackson Domesticity, we had an essay on the Mike Flanagan show, and I think it would be cool to have more investigation of that, the ways, the permutations of the show as it relates to the novel and ideas of adaptation. And I don't know, I think there's a fertile field even now for making those sorts of connections. And hopefully, like you said, we're going to have more things to watch and read as we go on.
Yeah, again, and it's sort of an unanswerable question, but I mean, if we've reached the stage where Shirley Jackson is now a character in Shirley Jackson style tales about Shirley Jackson writing Shirley Jackson tales. Have we reached like a Christopher Nolan style Shirley Jackson Inception, if that's the correct term, or peak Shirley, I suppose.
Now I want that movie.
Or is this the crest of a wave, and that, like, is Flannery O'Connor coming up the inside track and she's going to make a comeback, you know? This is why I wish we had a live event. We could have this conversation in the pub, you see, so that would listen, guys, and I think that's a great, I mean, it is the fact that Jackson has become kind of a memeable presence as well. I'm sure you've all seen it, but the amount of times on Twitter that, you know, very pithy little letter she writes about, you know, Mrs. White, if you don't like my peaches, don't shake my tree. You see that shared all the time by people who mightn't necessarily have read any Shirley Jackson, but they're just kind of going, isn't she kind of a badass, you know, that sort of thing. So it's even aspects like that are sort of taking off in an interesting way. But finally, I wanted to ask you both if there was anything that we haven't mentioned which you wanted to bring up before we draw this very pleasant conversation to a gentle close, or anything you'd like to mention. Or if either of you have anything you would like to promote, endorse, any projects you're working on, any new works coming out, please feel free to, you know, give a shout out to yourself here as well.
Well, I just want to say really quickly, I want someone out there to write something on Flannery O'Connor and Shirley Jackson now, because that would be awesome.
She went to O'Connor's house, didn't she, with Stanley?
She visited O'Connor's mom, yeah, after O'Connor had passed away. So that would be pretty cool. I think there's so many similarities between their work.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I
mean, that would be incredible. My own personal fan fiction would be her meeting Plath for lunch in 1952. You know, Plath asked to meet her when she was at Mademoiselle magazine, and one of the great kind of like myths, imagine, because she was such a, but I think that her and O'Connor, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Somebody needs to get that script into development, I think, Melanie. Yeah.
I'm going to work on that in my spare time.
I don't know, maybe the cover would be a peacock with glasses. I don't know how you would mash up the imagery of O'Connor and Jackson.
Oh no, no, I can't.
This is why I'm not an artist. Lisa, was there anything that you wanted to mention or publicize or about that you're working on?
No, I mean, I really think just, I want to continue telling people to read more Shirley Jackson. Even now, as we're talking, it makes me want to go back and reread things like Hangs a Man and Road Through the Wall and The Sundial and some of those maybe underread things of hers. And just also, we haven't talked too much about it, but her domestic sketches and the wonderful dark humor she had in talking about children and the struggles of that. Those are some of my favorite bits of her writing. So I would love to see more with that.
I think that's the great thing about Jackson too, is that even though the body of criticism about her is growing steadily by the day, there's wonderful work being done out there. There's still so much out there to explore. It's just, there's such a wealth of topics and themes associated with her. Yeah, she's a great subject. But sorry, I'm preaching to the converted here, because listen, guys, thank you so much. I just want to hold up your book again I can encourage people, if they haven't had a chance to pick it up, if you're at all interested in Jackson, it's Shirley Jackson, Influences and Confluences. Hopefully it's in your local library, or you can buy it as well, I'm sure. And it's a really tremendous collection, and the two editors, Lisa and Melanie, did a really brilliant job with it. So yes, it's I'm endorsing this collection. So thank you so much, guys. I appreciate you taking the time out as well to see us, and thank you so much for speaking to us here today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, it was fun.